So I like to start with Q&A just to give people a bit of time to run in. So let's start with a few 5 minutes of that, see if we're going to get any questions. I'm a lead game designer at EA, previously worked at Blizzard and Abercam Entertainment on a great game called Faria. If anyone has any questions about game design or development that I could reasonably answer, I'd be happy to just pop up some quick ones, or work history, whatever you want to talk about. You can also maybe ask questions about, I don't know, dogs, philosophy, board games, love role-playing games, all that good stuff. So I'm going to give people a second to settle in. If not, we'll just dive into the talk. So I'm not seeing anything pop up in the private chat here. So somebody was going to shepherd me additional questions if they thought they were worthy. So in the meantime, I guess I'll just get started since I'm not seeing anything. All right. Oh, wait, we got one. How to get ideas for a layout of a game when already a lot of games are in the market. Okay, another one is what's the best part of being a game dev? So the first one is how to get ideas for a layout of a game when a lot of games are already there in the market. Well, actually, I would say that makes it easier to get ideas for a game when there's lots of games already in the market. The nice thing about reinventing a wheel is you often learn a lot of neat reasons why people use wheels, but you don't usually make a better wheel. So it's really good as a side project to try to just question everything and redo everything, because it'll often give you a lot of great knowledge, but creativity and innovation are heavily overprized. Designers are not like, they don't have to be pure inventors. They're not, gods of new universes. Designers are chefs. Think Ratatouille. A designer is all about expressing their creativity with recipes, unusual takes, a new version of a classic dish, or mixing ingredients in ways that have never really been used before. As a chef, you don't need to invent a new vegetable. Originality isn't the point. Creativity in restriction, expression, making things people love in a new and fresh way. That's the point. So honestly, go study games. It's the first thing that we do as game devs when we start working on new features or new layouts or new UI. We go find lots of other games that have really creative and interesting ideas, and we try to find one that we really like and improve on it, or we try to mix the best ideas from several. Next, what's the best part of being a game dev? Honestly, it is having a job that no matter what you do, thousands to millions of people care about, to the point that they might send you death threats, which is certainly the negative side you hear about a lot. But what's amazing about it is even in the most toxic elements, it's because people are usually unhappy in their own lives and they care about your game, and your game is often something that can save them. I've also gotten the exact opposite that's related to that, which is I've gotten letters from players that have said, even my small indie game Faria, not just mine, by the way, we worked with a fantastic team, and I came on after the Kickstarter already happened, but I think of it as partly my baby too. Even that game Faria, which was relatively small, I got letters from people saying that saved their life, that they were in a really dark place and this game was something they could pour their heart into. And I also got reviews from people saying, this is the worst game ever. Why would anyone ever play this game? So the fact that people care about what you make and care about what you do in a really wonderful way, that you affect people's lives and their enjoyment of it, that's a wonderful thing about being a game dev, and it makes all the rest worth it. Next, do you recommend using game engines or rather media libraries? It's more of a software dev question. I'm actually pretty bad at computer science. I like to make my life as easy as possible. I think one of the best ways to learn game design and game development is start with modding, like Skyrim Creation Kit, Roblox, really easy to use modding tools or game engines to try to mess around with what a real game development studio is working with. Don't constantly try to reinvent engines and tweak at the base level when you don't have to. Iterate quickly and fast. I actually learned game design through board games originally and role-playing games. We could make a new game every 2 weeks, and it was amazing. Next one. What could a UI designer expect in game design, if you can answer that? A lot of frustration. I actually think UI designers should kind of tell game designers what to do. It's usually the other way around. Basically, a good UI requires a good game design. Often game designers have a lot of ideas. We make things overcomplicated, and that ultimately results in complex UI. good UI designers work with good game designers to simplify the design to make a better UI. Often I will, once I see the UI, if I can't make it simple enough, even in my mockups, I will cut whole systems or whole features because it just results in an overcomplicated screen. And an overcomplicated screen is a representation of the game within people's minds. And so it creates an overcomplicated game. It's very important to be willing to simplify and burn even things that you love. There's a great phrase in writing, actually, that you're finished when you cut everything you can possibly cut and then cut 30% more. I actually like to start with a too simple idea when I'm first a too simple solution whenever I'm creating something I believe is not enough to solve my problem or not enough to interest players, and then try to figure out why it's not enough. What should happen next? What does it need? And often it's actually enough, and I discover a new, more beautiful, more elegant game. What's changed in game design in the past 5 years? Everything. Like, there's so many genre shifts, so many tools updates. User-generated content has become this giant thing. There's been so many different genres that have come up. Auto chess, battle royale games. Like, there have been just huge swells and shifts of enthusiasm. But at the core of it, humans haven't changed. If you're somebody who understands cognitive science, somebody who understands how humans think and act and like things, you can always be relevant in game design. So basically, yeah, there's a lot of more fun questions here as well. I can't see your slides. Stuck in exploding design block. I'm still on exploding design block. All right. So I'm going to dive right into the presentation now. I'll get to the other stuff later, but this has been a lot of fun. So exploding design block. Let's get started. All right. So this is one of my favorite things in game development. This is from XKCD, great comic series. So we've got our time cost, strategy A, strategy B, and now finally this big bar, analyzing whether strategy A or B is more efficient. And this is the reason why we're all so inefficient. Very often it's very easy to try to argue heavily over which solution is just a little bit better. Or maybe it'll feel like a really big difference in your head, but ultimately the time you spent trying to agree on it could have been spent elsewhere to make the game better. If you spend an extra 5 hours of your game jam or your hackathon or whatever you're doing, or of course an extra month or two of your full game development project in a multi-year pipeline, well, that's a month, or on this scale, a few hours you could spend polishing the game, testing it, adding more content, making the game feel just a little bit better, making things more intuitive, fixing bugs. That time is valuable. And it is better to move ahead with a good solution than to try to worry about the best solution. So, moving right along. Here's the moral of this. A bad idea done well beats a great idea done poorly. I'm going to say it one more time. A bad idea done well beats a great idea done poorly. And doing things well takes time. Nobody is going to write a great first novel on the first draft. Nobody is going to create a great game on the first attempt. Games are iterative. They build, they evolve, they're living things. You try stuff out, and 10% of it is fun. If you're lucky, often it's more like 1% of it's fun, or it's not fun at all, but you think it might be someday, and you just keep polishing and iterating it, following that fun, and changing the game as you go. That takes time. Even if you're rushing to a very known destination, it takes time to polish things, to debug, to make game feel satisfying, to make the sound just the right intensity. Doing things well takes time. So ultimately, if you want to make a good game done well, you need to resolve design arguments quickly. This is incredibly important. As you move through your hackathon, you might need to run into some situations where you're if you're a solo practitioner, you're going to run into situations where you have multiple ideas and you're not sure which to choose. Flip a coin or just use one of the techniques we're going to be talking about going forward. But you have to resolve that fast. If you have other members of your project, often you will have very different ideas about what should be done and how it should be done best. So for that, you need to resolve design arguments between you quickly. Let's start with a scenario. Ready, everybody? This is actually a scenario based off of the type of thing I deal with every week in game development. People with very different ideas, very strong opinions that think they are absolutely correct and think the game should move in totally different directions. So here's a scenario. Hiding the body. Two designers are working on an action game, and they're having a debate. Now, Tom wants to do the following for the game. Give the players the option to hide the bodies of dead guards. It's an action game. They're infiltrating a facility. That's what he's excited about. Next, Rachel, different designer on the team, wants to not give the players this option. No options for the players. The corpses cannot be moved. So here's the question. Who's right? Well, here's Tom's argument first. First, he says, look, the reason I want to hide the body is I want to do increased strategic options. Options are great for players. I want to give players like lots of different ways to tackle every level and to tackle every problem. That variety, that agency is what makes great games. Second, it rewards the players for paying attention to the environment. Oftentimes great environments and great backgrounds can blur together, become tangled in the player's mind, or just become noise. Designers and developers spend a lot of time creating interesting hiding places, beautiful backdrops. A lot of times lore and really carefully placed parchments or posters are tucked into the sides. And if you're paying close attention to find good hiding spots, you're paying more attention to the environment. And that can make the game a much richer experience. Third, it's fun for stealth players. Stealth players are, a significant portion of a player base. They can have a lot of fun if they have agency over preventing other guards from noticing that they're there. And Tom really likes a lot of stealth games, and he knows what makes them fun, and that this change would make him really enjoy their game a lot more. Fourth, other players can ignore it if they don't like it. Look, he's not saying you have to play this way. If the game is mostly a main action game for everybody else, that's totally fine. He just wants to give people the option. This is Tom's argument, why we should be able to hide the bodies. Rachel says no option, no choice for players. So why would she possibly say this? Well, here are her arguments. First, it would take resources to implement, meaning less time to polish other gameplay. We've already talked about this. It's not just this or nothing, potentially. It's this or maybe a better action loop, better gun controls, faster momentum, level design that's more focused, fewer bugs, releasing a month earlier. There's a lot of things you can do with the same amount of resources, and you should always consider stuff based on what else you could be having, what else you could be accomplishing with those resources. Second, players might get confused, thinking they have to hide bodies when they don't. If they, for example, put a tutorial in that teaches you how to hide bodies, because players need to know how to do that, many players might start thinking they're supposed to do that, and then even though it is technically an option, players might get misled, and Rachel might think that hiding the bodies, that stealth gameplay, might be fun for some players, but won't be fun for most of their players. And so she doesn't want to maybe confuse them within that. The next, stealth gamers can just play a different game. This is like her final argument. Look, I don't want to make our game for stealth gamers. They can just play another game. We don't need to spend time working this option in. So here's the question again. Who's right? Well, it's a really tricky problem. Some people probably have strong opinions about this immediately. Feel free to type them in the chat if you have them. But as some of you have also probably guessed, it's impossible to resolve this until we know what type of game we're making. This is actually a scenario from a real, very famous game, if you know the history of game development, which is Wolfenstein 3D. This exact discussion happened when the studio of id Software was originally creating Wolfenstein 3D, which was the basically the grandfather, the first-person shooter genre, before the same team invented Doom. And for a long time, all FPS games were called Doom clones. So Wolfenstein was about being Rambo-style action hero, going into Nazi castles and blowing up Nazis. And so they originally were implementing a mechanic to hide the bodies of dead guards in their game. It was in the original Wolfenstein, in fact. But when they implemented it, it was slowing everything down. It was getting in the way. The game was about momentum, speed, aggression. And so ultimately, John Romero said this, the designer of the game. Anything that's going to stop us from mowing stuff down, get rid of it. This is a direct quote, and they ultimately took this mechanic that was already in their game, so it actually took time to remove it, which defeats one of the original arguments that Rachel... they would actually make Rachel's argument stronger, actually. It wasn't going to take time to add it. It would take time to remove it. So they spent resources to take it out of the game to focus the game more on their hard action. That was what the game was all about. However, there's another game that actually is also related to John Romero because it's by Ion Storm, and that is Deus Ex. Deus Ex is a fascinating game. It still holds up to this day. It has phenomenal open sprawling levels, lots of weird mechanics and controls. You gotta get used to it, but it's really worth it. I highly recommend picking it up on Steam if you're interested in like what like games were doing even decades ago, how amazing and cinematic and sprawling they could be, how much they could do with how little. Deus Ex is a wonderful game where it is all about player choice. It is all about the freedom to tackle problems the way you want to tackle them. It is all about, you can be an action hero, or you can be a stealth player, or you can be like a hacking assassin. There's so many different ways you can play the game and so many different solutions to every level. It's really, really cool. And Warren Spector had, one of the major creators behind Deus Ex, had this to say about the game. If we got compared to the single-purpose games, we'd get crushed. But if people got that they could play however they wanted, we'd rule the world. People got it, and they did rule the world. This game made his career. Deus Ex was a phenomenal success and is still held up as one of the shining examples of early game design triumphs. But it's true, the action game play in Deus Ex is not as good as the action games of other dedicated action games of the time. The stealth wasn't as good as the stealth games, but the freedom of choice, the agency to solve the problem how you wanted to solve it, that is what this game was all about. And so we lead to another quote. You cannot answer any question about your game until you know your design goals. Dan Felder. That's me. I use this phrase all the time to solve game design problems. So many times I feel like we're getting into a Rachel Tom situation where there's two designers who both have strong preferences that are talking about what they like in games or what they think would be good for this game without constantly bringing it back to what is the design goal. When you're working on a project, especially a project you got to make quickly, you need to make sure that your game's goals are as clear and explicit as possible, because they can help you determine what a good idea looks like in the context of your game. It's like a recipe. You don't know if salt or sugar makes more sense in your recipe until you know you're making ice cream or making potato chips. Those two things work totally differently depending on what your goal is. Otherwise, you get a very, very strange mix where you end up with like ketchup on ice cream because people can't agree what the overall goal for the game is. So here's our first tool for designing quickly: goal-driven design. It's all about goal-driven design. Now we're going to get started and talk about some examples of how that works. So first you're going to do is you're going to establish your design goals. This is Doom, the recent reboot, since we're still talking about first-person shooter genre. And there's actually a great talk about Doom Eternal on GDC, which really emphasizes the principle that we're talking about here. So the main thing you want to ask yourself is this: what should the player experience feel like during the game? That's your design goal. The same thing for a feature. How should this menu make people feel? What is the theme of our game? What are we trying to evoke? And also, what are the functionality? What do we need to accomplish? Focus on your functional goals and your player experience goals at all times. And this actually just has a fantastic example from the creators of Doom Eternal. This was their design goal. You are the Doom Marine, hell's worst nightmare, beating back the relentless assault of unimaginable evil. As a game designer, this is really useful for me. With this type of information, I know so much about how I'm going to start designing this game, these levels, these weapons. So first off, I'm hell's worst nightmare. There's a lot of games that feature demons and terrifying situations in the first-person genre where the enemies are terrifying. But here, I'm the one scaring them. They're terrified of me. So I don't want to create, for example, a bunch of stealth sequences in this game where I have to desperately avoid being noticed and I'm really scared someone might find me. I don't want to have big prowling demons that make it feel like a horror thing. No, I want them to be scared of me. So I'm not going to design those types of experiences. Also, the relentless assault of unimaginable evil. Relentless. There's always action happening. There's always momentum. We're going to have some breathers, but only as much as we need to let players refocus on the battle ahead. This is very, very helpful. I can already start thinking about how I'm going to build levels, how I'm going to build weapons, all these types of things. Additionally, there was another key piece of their combat specifically: make me think, make me move. This was immensely, immensely valuable for their design goals. This talk tells you how to design weapons, how to design encounters, how to design enemies. We need players to be moving. That means we're going to do stuff like create burning terrain so they can't stay in one place too long. We're going to make them run up to some enemies that can only be beaten in melee, which means we're going to need some melee weapons, and we're going to need some ranged weapons so that there's reasons to get away from enemies sometimes as well. We're going to constantly make them try to solve strategic problems, and we're going to make them have to move a lot. That type of dynamic, what they ended up calling combat chess, was very instructive for the designers in building out their game. Next, you're going to want to find a similar game that has similar design goals, either from the same genre or potentially, if you can't find one, from as similar genre as possible, but that has very obviously similar design goals. The reason is simple. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and a game runs at 30 to 60 frames per second usually. So from this, we can conclude a similar game is worth thousands of design documents. This is so important. What's been the biggest problems from any creative debate is making sure you're even arguing over the same thing. The problem with games is there are so many moving pieces, so many moving parts, and often if you're creating something new, it is very, very easy to imagine why an idea wouldn't work. Often you'll have somebody at a meeting that is saying something that to you can imagine, you're imagining all the ways it won't work. And when you propose your idea, they're imagining all the ways it won't work. But both of you are imagining ways in which your idea probably would work. That's why you get all these crazy fun behind-the-scenes creative stories about how, for example, this is a real story, Stan Lee originally pitched Spider-Man, the idea of a teenage superhero, which was very unusual at the time, with spider powers, to his boss. And his boss said, no, this is the worst idea I've ever heard. We're never going to do it. There's a great video of Stan Lee telling this story. And Stan Lee ultimately decided to do it in a little disposable one-shot comic just to get the idea out of his head because he was sure it was going to be really good. And that issue just sold like crazy. People loved it. And so then his boss ran over to his office and said, Stan, remember that idea about the teenage superhero that you and I both loved? And so the funny thing about this is it makes his boss kind of sound, stupid. But they probably weren't. The thing is, they were probably just, since they didn't have any reference for a teenage superhero before, they were probably just imagining a version in their head where it was very kiddie, very childish. It just didn't seem like it was going to work based on how they were imagining it. But Stan Lee had a very different vision in their head about how they were imagining how it would work. So when you have a similar game and you can point to, look, this game shows all the moving pieces in action, and we're going to make our game like this, but with these 3 specific changes. Make your game just like this, but with these 3 specific changes. Maybe a different theme, maybe a different art style, maybe a different core mechanic. But this can be the place we start on the same page with, and then make a few specific changes to it. That is amazingly valuable for making sure your team is always on the same page and is always, or at least as close as possible, imagining the same ideas and solutions. This is also how genres happen. Dark Souls has spawned the Soulsborne genre, or the Souls-like genre. So many games say, let's make it like Dark Souls, but it's going to be Star Wars. Let's make it like Dark Souls, but it's going to be samurai. Let's make it like Dark Souls, but we're going to emphasize a mythological epic combat. Or let's make it like Dark Souls, but let's make it massive PvP MMO. There are so many games that lean into the core mechanics or the progression systems, or both, of Dark Souls, and have built that the foundation of a genre. And so that's how genres happen. They say, let's make it like this. I mentioned before, Doom started the FPS craze, and for a long time, first-person shooters were called Doom clones for this reason. So, looks like I just got a random alert. Not important. All right. And so this is how genres happen, because there's so much utility in basing a game off of a known starting point and then slowly improving pieces of it or innovating in key places. Find a similar game. Do it now. Finally, if it's not a key innovation, just copy their homework. If your game is not about reinventing a menu, for example, just base your solution off of a great existing menu. If you really want to +1 a game's usability, though, like Dark Souls actually had very poor usability, you could say, let's just do just like Dark Souls and focus entirely all our innovation budget off of making much better menus, much better signposting about where you're supposed to go, and much better key control schemes for like equipping spells and leveling up. So if it's not your key innovation, copy their homework. You've got enough problems when you start getting innovative because you don't have a clear blueprint. So you want to minimize your risks and your weirdness everywhere else you can. All right, so first tool was design goals, goal-driven design. That is very important for resolving arguments. The second tool is fast brainstorming tricks. I have a whole bundle of these, and I didn't have time to talk through them all, so I'm just going to go through a few. I find that it is incredibly valuable to have a few go-to, don't just go in front of a whiteboard and shout out ideas. It's not very useful. What you want is to constantly be tricking your brain and stimulating it in new ways to give you cool ideas. So I'm going to show you the most terrifying thing that any creative in any way always ever deals with, the blank page. We're scared of this. Where do you even begin? So, well, the place I always begin with is take the white space off the page. I'm going to do a little exercise now. I want everybody to do this with me. I'm going to basically ask you to start naming some stuff. Just think about all the things you can think about. You don't need to put them in chat or anything. I want you to just name mentally every object you can think of in the entire world that exists. Go, just name anything in your head, as many as you can for 15 seconds. And starting. And we're done. So most people will get about, say, 6 to 8 total things in there. If you got way more, awesome. If you were looking around the room to get some, that's normal as well, because your brain starts seeking stimuli. And now we're going to do that exercise again with a slight twist. I want you to name every object you can think of, or anything at all, that you might find in someone's refrigerator. In a refrigerator. Go. 15 seconds. And we're done. Most people get about as many of those as they do at the first one. And often when people find that the second time they do it, it feels a little easier when they're just thinking about stuff in a refrigerator. Why is that? Is there more stuff in the entire world or in a refrigerator? I mean, we know this, right? But how can our brains have about as difficult a time or an easier time on the refrigerator question than on the everything in the world question? And the answer is really simple. Limitations give your brain direction. Our brains are packed with ideas, knowledge, and creativity. You just need to figure out how to frame the problem. Your brain is like a gigantic Google search engine, and you're just trying to type the right keywords to find the thing that already exists in it. That is so important. Our brains are packed with ideas, knowledge, and creativity. You just need to figure out how to frame the problem. So many times, I've been stuck on problems for forever, and someone has asked me the question in a slightly different way, or I've made myself think about the problem from a slightly different direction. And suddenly, things that were unsolvable become solved immediately. And I have collected over the years the types of stimuli that I use to come up with what people think of as creative ideas or creative solutions extremely quickly. I'm going to give you some of my highlights, but there's also a lot more. If you're interested, there's a great book called A Whack on the Side of the Head. I highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in this topic. But let's just dive into the next ones. So we're going to try out some different refrigerators. That's what I like to call these framing devices. So one is mixing two different things. This is a major piece of creativity, mixing two different things. First, Aliens was actually pitched as Jaws on a spaceship originally. Alien is a great science fiction horror movie, great psychological horror movie. It really established huge pillars of the science fiction and psychological horror genres, but it was pitched as Jaws, the shark movie, on a spaceship. And you can kind of see how that fits. Once you start using this model of taking one thing that's good and mixing it with a new thing that's good, or at least interesting, then how you recontextualize all those creative ideas creates something new. So the very first thing when I want to start getting creative is I mix two different things, and you can mix them really fast. And the cool thing about this is creativity is kind of like a muscle. You start training your brain to do this a lot. If you want to just get really good at coming up with ideas fast that people think of as creative, just try starting to mix two things or find similarities between two totally different things. One of my favorite examples from a random exercise based on this was people were asked to mix um, for making a new candy product. They were asked to mix candy with Russian roulette, and the thing that came out of that was somebody proposed this idea that you've got this box of red candies that all look the same, and most of them are raspberry and they're tasty, but every one of them is ultra spicy jalapeno. So the idea is you're taking this candy, and every now and then one is incredibly, insanely spicy. And so this creates a really fun kind of interactive candy game that you can play with your friends, which I thought was really cool. And I never would have thought of that. In fact, I didn't, but somebody else did think of it by trying to mix these two things. And that thought was really, really sweet. So there's actually a really great example of this as well from one of my favorite book series. Basically, Jim Butcher, really good author, I love their work, was was talking at an online writers conference, and the people were arguing whether good ideas were more important than good execution, which was more important. And he held fast that a great writer could make a great story out of not just one bad idea, but two bad ideas. I think he's cheating a little here because two bad ideas, I'd argue, is easier than one bad idea because you can mix them together in cool ways. And the person said, okay, what about you mix the following: a lost Roman legion and Pokemon? And people kind of laughed, and he said, you know what, I'm going to do it. He went off and he started thinking about it, and he released what became my favorite high fantasy series ever. Really, I'll take this high fantasy series over anything else. It's my absolute favorite. The Codex Alera. This is book 3, Cursor's Fury. And you can kind of see how they mix together. He took the idea of this Roman gladiatorial society with big emphasis on citizenship and so on, and mixed it with the idea of controlling elemental spirits that they used in war and battle, and had a real emphasis on their concept of the elements. So the Codex Alera came out of this absurd mixing of ideas. It's a wonderfully interesting and creative setting, and I read it loving it before I knew anything about its origins. And it was only after I found out that, oh my gosh, I can totally see, the High Lords are the gym leaders and everybody's got their own Pokemon. This makes total sense. And it's really, really cool how this setting came out of that mix. Try mixing two different things. Next, adapt ideas through new lenses. Take a cool idea from a very different place and ask how would it work in your own idea. A good example I gave when I was talking to I was mentoring a designer, and I was mentioning this. He was saying he had real trouble trying to come up with new ideas. And I said, well, one good technique that I use is I try to take an idea and I use it in a new lens. So I say, let's say I'm imagining an Overwatch hero or something. What if I put Superman in Overwatch? How would that work? And I remember in the meeting, I just started talking through it, and I was like, well, okay, Overwatch is a team-based shooter. I've never worked on Overwatch, by the way, just to be clear. This is pure imagination. But I was saying, all right, well, Overwatch is like a team-based shooter, and Superman is an incredibly powerful character that is weak to kryptonite. So how would that work in Overwatch? I guess it would be an extremely powerful character that, is super strong, is really, really not invulnerable. That wouldn't be fun, but has a lot of health. However, when he shows up on the map, then an object might spawn somewhere on the map, like a hidden kryptonite style thing. If you get it, you have his weakness. And so people can run around the map and find that. And then if you're equipped with a kryptonite chunk, you deal 3 times damage to this character, and you could take him out really effectively. So that would be kind of interesting. I don't know if it would be fun, but certainly I never would have gotten this character idea of a really powerful character that you have to go hunt for their weakness and then use it to become the person that can take them down. And you have a dynamic, exciting idea of who should be trying to attack them, but which could be different from map to map based on who finds the kryptonite chunk when. So that was a really interesting idea that I thought just of 5 minutes with this technique, and it's really fun. A great game that also did this well is also referencing Dark Souls, Salt and Sanctuary. They basically said, what if we took Dark Souls, but what would it look like as a 2D Metroidvania game? Dark Souls is a famous third-person action adventure game. What about a 2D Metroidvania game with sprawling levels and two-dimensional combat? How would that work? They actually replicated the key elements of Dark Souls, the dodge rolling, the stamina bar, the blocking, and created a really, really fun, unique, and very stylistic platformer that is obviously asking, what does Dark Souls look like through this new lens? It's a really fun source of creative ideas. Finally, here's a topic I get all the time. I want to talk about it: balancing your game. Many people ask me, like, how do you start, balancing your game when you start working on it? What are your spreadsheets? What are your formulas? I'm going to give my best possible advice on how to balance your game. Don't balance your game. Balancing happens at the end as polish. When you start balancing your game before you even start making it, that's like trying to oil the hinges of a house and then you realize you built the whole house underwater. Balance is such a fine polish thing that it's all about everything being perfectly in sync and incentivized to the point that it is resilient to thousands or millions of players trying to outthink you and outsmart you. It can only happen once everything else about your game is really nailed down. So you should not balance at the beginning. Just get it close enough that you can tell if your game is remotely fun once it's balanced. Then, once you don't want to change anything else, you can spend the extra amount of time it takes to really balance your game. Often people will try to figure out the balance ahead of time before they've even gotten into play testing, which is really, really, really counterproductive. Or they'll try to get the one build and start balancing it quickly, and then they realize they want to change a core mechanic or add a new weapon or or change fundamentally a rule of the game, and then all the balancing work is wasted. It's like balancing is really like grammar checks and spell checks at the end of a project. You should focus, if you're going to rewrite or take out whole chapters of your novel, you don't need to care too much about getting everything polished and perfect yet. Balancing happens at the end as polish. Don't do it early. Just get it close enough that you can tell if it will be fun once it is balanced. However, I know I can't stop you, and I want to give one useful thing anyway. So if you must balance, use this technique. It's called triple tapping. I've used this for everything. Let's talk about a scenario again. You got an ability, and it deals 100 damage. And you think this ability is too weak. You want this ability to be stronger. Now, you think it's about 30% too weak, so you think it'll be balanced at 130 damage. You might have formulas demonstrating this, or it might just be a gut feel, but you think that it's too weak at 100 damage, and so you want to move it to 130 damage. Don't move it to 130 damage. I don't care that you think that it's 30% too weak. You might be wrong. What you should do is move it to 200 damage. Just double it. This is really, really useful. Now, the reason is simple, and it actually is a strategy that comes from like tank warfare advice. If the first shot is too low, the next one better be too high. Why is this? Well, let's say we bump it to 130 damage, and it's still too low. Now, what have we learned? Well, we've learned it was too low at 100, and we've learned it's also too low at 130. There are infinite remaining possibilities. Whereas, let's say if we jump to 200 damage, if it's still too low for some reason, then we saved ourselves a lot of time. Often people will go, try 130, try 140, try 150, and it wastes weeks. Go from 100 to 200, though, and you're likely to overshoot the target. That's the goal. You want to overshoot it. Because let's say 200 is still way, way too high. That's great. But maybe it wasn't as high as you thought. Maybe you realize the actual goal is somewhere around the 150 damage range. And by establishing your too low point and a too high point, we very quickly narrow out exactly where the right number is. So the reason it's called triple tapping is you try to take 3 shots at the right number. You try the first one, then if it's too powerful, you go intentionally too low. Often just cut the power level in half. It's a really good way to quickly get to a heuristic that humans intuitively understand. We think of things as ratios. We understand doubling and halving on a very intuitive level. But it won't always work for every game. Sometimes cutting something in half is way too much or way too little for a specific game for various reasons. The intentional point is just overshoot the target. If it's too weak, overshoot the target at the top level. Establish the bounds. And then once you have that information, you can take a very precise third guess, which minimizes your total iteration time by a lot. Also, I like to start things overpowered so people pay attention. If it's not fun when it's overpowered, it won't be fun when it's fair. It's a very common problem. Basically, people will often put a new ability into their game or a new character, and it will start off maybe a little too weak. or maybe just it's just fair. It's fine. And so playtesters don't feel an urge to switch on to it. Whereas if you put in a new weapon or a new ability and it's intentionally too strong, and it's still not fun, very useful information, but also people will notice it in playtests and they'll pay attention to it. So it helps you get your focus where you really want it to be. So start things intentionally too powerful, see if they are too powerful, maybe they're just awesome, and then try to make them intentionally too weak for the second iteration and aim for the correct iteration at the third time. But again, especially for hackathon, don't worry about this at all. This is polished stuff once your game is already in really, really solid shape. And then if you're working on a really big title, there's a lot of formulas and stuff you can do to polish it to perfection, into a glorious sheen. But that's out of the scope of this talk. This is about exploding design block. Just get moving. Well, that's all, folks. These are 3 books I always recommend to game designers. They're utterly fantastic. Each one of them is so, so powerful. First, The Gamer's Brain by Celia Hodent. This is a UX book on UI and UX. She is a fantastic, fantastic UX designer and researcher. Worked on Fortnite, worked on Epic Games on a lot of different projects. And this book is amazing. It is. If you read this book as a game designer, you are going to understand a deep breakdown of practical cognitive science and how it applies to game development in ways you can use in any project. I've even recommended it to people who are interested in this outside of video games because it's just that good. The next one is Decisive, How to Make Better Choices in Life and Work. If I'm going to recommend one book that is fun to read and is unbelievably useful, it's always this book. Whenever a designer asks me to recommend one book to them, I always pick Decisive. This is a book about how people make decisions. And guess what? If you are dealing with humans making decisions in your game, which I would argue is what nearly all games are all about, players making decisions, even if it's just what button to press in a certain circumstance, understanding how humans make decisions, how you might expect them to make decisions one way and how they're actually going to make them, what decisions stress them out, which ones they enjoy. Decisive will help you understand the cognitive science model of how humans think. Additionally, if you're a human who ever has to make decisions in your own life, this will help you make those decisions better by exposing you to cognitive biases and good, useful mental models of how to think about problems. I come to this book so often, and I've used it to make serious career decisions and personal decisions all the time. It is so valuable. Third, Michael Lewis's The Undoing Project. This is also a book about cognitive biases. All good design is about how humans think. And The Undoing Project is about the founders of the field of cognitive science that led to the famous book Thinking Fast and Slow. And Michael Lewis is a brilliant and very fun writer who also wrote books like Moneyball and The Big Short. And this is another fascinating and wonderful book. Really fun read. And well, that's all I've got. I think we've got some more time left, so why don't we dive into some more questions than the answers thereof. Hope you've enjoyed Exploding Design Block. I believe also this is going to be recorded, by the way, because I know I like to go fast because I get really excited about design. All right, so what other questions have we had from last time? Also totally excited to get more. What's my favorite game came up? That is impossible to answer, and I'm not going to try. But I will tell you some games that I absolutely love. Secret of Monkey Island is a brilliant game that really holds up, and it is a wonderful, fun point-and-click adventure game that makes you like point-and-click adventure games if you usually don't. I highly recommend checking out The Secret of Monkey Island. It has a remastered edition. It's great. I love Portal as a brilliant puzzle game that made me think differently about the world. The Thinking with Portals tagline is real. I love Dark Souls for being a game that really challenged one of my favorite design precepts, which is elegance in design. Dark Souls has lots of terrible sections and rough edges and terrible decisions and unfair moments, but the high highs are so good, and it so much has its own vision and its own unique, beautiful design goals that it more than makes up for it. So it's a really good example of how making a few moments in your game 11 out of 10, like 11 out of 10, will make up for a lot of 4 out of 10 moments down the road. It's better to be something that some people love and some people hate than something that everybody just kind of thinks is mediocre. Another thing, what genres do you think are over or underrepresented? I think that, gosh, over and underrepresented is a little hard. We're seeing a lot of clones of the sort of hot battle royale games that's similar right now. And we're seeing, like, of course, there's the whole auto chess gold rush going on. I think that I actually would say that point-and-click adventure games have a lot of potential to be phenomenal, and there was some really interesting innovation in that, but it kind of got swallowed up by visual novels. And I would love to see more games made in that light. I also think that that first-person story-rich games have become heavily underserved compared to big multiplayer action titles recently. The video game industry goes through these gold rushes where like a big successful game comes out, and then everybody wants to replicate that success, and then for a while people just assume that this is the way you have to do things. And so we had like the first person shooter gold rush, we had the story game gold rush, we had the point and click gold rush originally, with the Sierra Online big market. We had like the multiplayer shooter gold rush, the battle royale, the MMO. And so we're in a series of gold rushes, and solo solo single player narrative heavy games that have like no real online multiplayer component can tell incredible stories, and I think that many games have proved that players want them, and that there's a lot of excitement for them, and I'd love to see that. What do I look for in games? Genre, gameplay, story, etc. It totally depends on my mood. I love different games that offer me different experiences. I would much rather get a completely wonderful type of experience of one specific type than a diluted sort of than a diluted, unexciting one. Like I played Hades recently. It was so good. Hades is a wonderful game, and it is entirely focused on pushing that envelope. I've also played games that have nearly every genre that I adore. I tend to look for things that are really elegantly designed, have strong theme, have a really powerful design goal that they are 100% all in on delivering on, and offer me opportunities for mastery. One of my favorite things I like to say is, unless it's purely a narrative game and there's no like skill component at all, which is great. Like I love those too. But for most of the games that I really get into, that I stick with for a long time, I like games that are like easy to learn and impossible to master. Not just hard to master, but like impossible. So yeah, that I tend to look for those elements in games, that focused theme and design goal. So also, oh, good question. So yeah, also I want to say that, like, by the way, if you're from the Sacramento area, the SDC is a community developed really with a lot of great people that is focused on growing gaming talent and helping people with projects. Lots of great community resources that you should check it out. There's going to be like a Discord link in the chat. I've done some stuff with them before. They're great people. We played Among Us. That was fun. And also been involved with some of their projects before. Like if you're in the Sacramento area, totally check them out. All right. So what do I think about microtransactions? That's a really fun one. I actually love this topic. Microtransactions, like, they started with arcades, right? Insert a quarter to get one more life in a game, and you get 5 minutes of gameplay. Dragon's Lair was a microtransaction machine. So many great games started as microtransaction arcade games. So one of the things that I think is really important to ask is, what is the purpose of a microtransaction in your game? Now, oftentimes, microtransactions are used to make a game healthier and to make it better from the developers and the players. A really good example of this, if you just look at the comparative price of games throughout the years, right? Like, look at how much a like Castlevania, NES game, few kilobytes of data, small team, made in a few months, how much that game sold for in modern day dollars. I think I looked this up recently. It was like $90 in today's cash. That's less than like a 200-person multi-year development team game sells for as the base price. So the general solution is you can ask everybody to pay a higher price, or you can offer that flexibility for purchasers. So I think using them. Another thing which is really interesting is, a reason that games often get rushed out the door is because developers need to, have a salary. And so if the game studio is out of money and needs to ship their game, even if it's kind of has bugs in it, it's often that you have to ship the game now or the studio is going to go bankrupt and people are going to lose their jobs. So they have to ship it now. And what you really like when that exists is to have DLC or ongoing content that still needs to be made for players so that developers can keep their jobs and have time to breathe and innovate. A lot of people's favorite game developers like Blizzard and Supercell and mobile, they're people that have really robust ongoing revenue streams for their top games, like subscriptions or microtransactions of some kind, and that allows them the safety net to be really creative and to try lots of different stuff. So it's all about how you use them. There's no such thing as a good or bad inherent like concept of how you handle that. It's really about what are you doing, what's your model, how are you going to deliver great game for players while keeping a healthy creative lifestyle for devs. This presentation was so interesting and helpful, Evelyn. Thank you. I'm very glad to hear that. Solo Story is my favorite. Yes, I loved the new God of War reboot. There is so much great stuff that's still coming over the horizon, and I can't wait to see which games follow in those footsteps. So take on this. What happened with Cyberpunk? Then I have no idea what happened with Cyberpunk. Like that, I'm sure infinite articles. I am not part of the company. I'm not going to comment on it. All right. Any additional questions, or are we bad at time? That's another question. Chris or Jen, are we at time now, or do we have time for a bit more? Time is good. Okay. Well, I'll keep going until they shut me up. So does anybody else have questions they would like to ask? Aha, I've got looks like 14 more minutes. By the way, if you're typing in questions, I only see what is like directed for me to see. So I'm not seeing everything that you guys are seeing. Just gonna sit here quietly, browse through, make sure I haven't missed anything. Let's see. Do I make any games as personal projects on the side? Oh, yes. So many. I love making different tabletop role-playing games. I love making, like, I'm constantly working on side projects. I run my own campaigns. I actually think, by the way, if you're interested in game design, or you think you might be interested in game design, that one of the best things you can do is start a Dungeons & Dragons campaign or any other tabletop role-playing game system. One of the best things you can do if you want to build a whole world is do that. I actually have a guy at work who is a brilliant producer, and he's interested in moving into game design. And he asked me for advice, and I said, just start running a D&D game or your own system. Build your own system and run that. You can make level design, you can make worlds, you can make narrative, you can make characters, you can make weapons, you can make abilities, all in just by yourself. And you can create 5 hours of content every week, no problem. It would take you years to do that in like the video game development world. And he's been doing it, and he's loving it. And you can just see that there's so many ways he's growing as a designer. It's how I really learned game design originally. I experimented with D&D. I still pull a lot of my old advice that I wrote in my notebooks about how to build good encounters and good boss fights to my current design goals and design problems. It was incredibly helpful. But also, like, I still use it myself. Recently, I originally was very narrative-heavy dungeon master. I really like to create very focused story experiences inspired by like Dragon Age and BioWare. And that's what drove me into the game industry originally. But recently, I decided to try to figure out how to do open world game design. And I was building like a D&D campaign, a series of D&D campaigns over the last 2 years that are all using open world ideas inspired by Breath of the Wild, Ubisoft games, fantastic different sandboxes of all those different types. And I also like forever games and looters like Destiny and Pillars of Eternity for long-term progression. I'm not Pillars of Eternity, Path of Exile for long-term progression, Warframe. And these games have been inspiring me, and I've been making my own RPG systems and my own RPG campaigns based on them, and I love them. I also work on other stuff on the side as well, like board games and card games. Mostly, I like to work in analog, not digital, on my side projects, because it's faster. You can try out ideas more quickly, and it's very different than what I do on a day-to-day at work. So it's very, very helpful. I also think that humans are inherently very tactile in how they think about things. So keeping one foot on the tactile side of game development is helpful in grounding my ideas when I get into that space. Leon says D&D is a creative design process. Totally agree. Favorite 4X? Ooh, that is tricky. There's so many great ones. I'm actually going to do a shout out for a great EA mobile game. Command and Conquer Rivals was just wonderful. It kind of blew my mind. Like in terms, if you want to look at study an elegant design, like Command and Conquer Rivals, boiled down so much of what I love about StarCraft and Age of Mythology and all these wonderful titles. And it boiled that down into a really like functional phone game. And I was impressed by how much they simplified. But if I'm just going to pick my favorite ever, it would really be Age of Mythology. I grew up playing that game so many times. Went through every campaign, learned every cheat, beat every map without the cheats. Never did much PvP, but I absolutely loved building all those fantastic myth units and how that changed combat. It really gave my like 12-year-old brain something to anchor onto. Like Hoplite has advantage against cavalry that didn't really feel very evocative, but like yeah, Minotaur, Pegasus is a scouting unit. I loved that stuff. I'd love to see more of that. How can people stay connected with me? Why would anybody want to? But if you do, for some strange reason, I do have a Twitter at designer Dan F. It's like a game designer, then Dan, then F, like my last name. At designer Dan F is good. I actually do a podcast called The GM's Guide, where I talk about tricks for building games and campaigns. I have a blog at danfelder.net that has a lot of old stuff and old just random thoughts on game design if you want to check it out, but I update it relatively infrequently. If you're also somebody who's looking to get into the game development industry, especially as a game designer, I'm happy to connect with you on LinkedIn. Just look up Dan Felder. I am always like, I try to make time, especially for students who are interested in becoming game designers or anybody in the industry already that just is interested in moving into game design or is already in game design. Always happy to chat. Cool. All right. Any final questions? Favorite philosophy reference interpretation in a game? I really like Bioshock's breakdown into Ayn Rand's like Ayn Rand's theories as represented with a game world. Like Bioshock's is a real sort of like was pitched as a game world exploration of objectivism, and I really liked that philosophical grounding and how it inspired so many creations of the game's themes of agency and choice. That I thought was really fun. There's some really cool stuff in there. I also think that here's a little indie title that I absolutely adored. This is a point-and-click adventure game as well. I don't know why I'm bringing up point-and-click adventure games so much. I don't usually love them, but when I love them, I love them. This is one I love. There is a game called Primordia. 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 It's a little indie game that was published as like a passion project. It has like a 98% approval rating on Steam or something, which is insane, especially for the point and click genre. People just get raging about certain puzzles in those genres and they'll leave a downvote. So it's amazing to see it's that high, and it is amazing. I left a review on this game, which is rare for me, and I told truthfully that I had, like when I was playing it for the first time, the heat went out in my apartment in like winter. And rather than like go get that fixed, go get a new heater, I just bundled up in my in like a giant coat, put heavy gloves on, and kept playing because I just was that hooked. It's a fascinating game about basically robots in a post-apocalyptic setting where humans are a myth. Like humans are a mythological creator that the robots envision as a perfect machine. And it is funny and witty, and it's so carefully done. The theming is so good. I was talking to the designer of it and the writer and saying that he really wanted to make a character, if it's a point-and-click adventure game, your character needs to be somebody who wouldn't solve things with violence, who wouldn't ask other people to solve problems for them. And what does that do for a character based around that? And the philosophy of that game, the nature of existence and will, and coping with the idea of mysterious origins is fascinating. It's rich, it's fun, and it's silly. It's a great game with wonderful world building. A deep immersive world in just a few 2D screens. It's fascinating. What's a good platform that you use that helps with game design? I actually love Tabletop Simulator. This really gets to the card game, like the card game and tabletop stuff that I like using, like Roll20 and similar virtual tabletops as well for those types of prototypes. Between Tabletop Simulator and like a virtual tabletop like Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds, you can kind of simulate any game you want to make that has it can either be paper prototyped, and we do paper prototyping a lot in games, or you can just make a card game or board game. I have like 700 hours on Tabletop Simulator, and about 1/7 of that is playing games other people have made. Most of that is playing different prototypes and projects of card games, board games that I've worked on. Tabletop Simulator has an amazing workshop system by which you can kind of grab a game asset that almost any other game has ever made, and you can just start messing around with it. And one thing that I really love about it is when I play a board game that I kind of like but don't really like, I try to change the rules and then make it better. If I want to make my own board game, I'll just upload my own cards to it. There's a lot of really easy tools you can do to make card games. Magic Set Editor is a good example of that. You can use that to just make any card game, not just a Magic card. And I use my prototyping for card games on Tabletop Simulator all the time. Play with friends on Steam. Great tool. All right. I think that is everything. Or everything that I can reasonably answer. All right, well, I think we have time for just one more, but other than that, I'm happy to end a little bit early, because we did start a little bit late because the previous talk apparently was fantastic, and I'm going to have to go watch it. Last one, what do you think of D&D in VR? So actually, I'm going to use this to talk about VR versus AR. I think that people are over-focusing on virtual reality when augmented reality is a really fun thing. At least I'm not sure if this is more applicable or less applicable during a pandemic. Probably less applicable. But assuming we get rid of the pandemic problem, basically virtual reality is incredibly powerful, incredibly compelling, but it is inherently limited. Whenever you have a limited install base, because the hardware costs a lot, which eventually that'll get cheaper. But the problem is the space. You need a dedicated room for VR often, unless you're just going to be using it as a very immersive full visor screen experience while you're sitting still. And that's usually that sitting still part doesn't really deliver on the full excitement and what people are really excited about VR. It's that extra immersion, exploring another world. But ultimately, you can't touch that world. So there's a bit of a disconnect, and you start to, and you can, and if you're not going to be walking around in a limited space, you're going to be sitting still, which makes it really good for starship simulators or things where you're naturally sitting, or just really immersive versions of Beat Saber or Tetris. Because then if you just want a fully immersive experience, that's really cool. But inherently, as long as the hardware is more expensive, there's going to be a lower install base. That means fewer developers are going to design explicitly for it, which means the development budgets won't be expected to if you're not expecting to sell as many units because there aren't as many customers, you don't get as big a budget, and then the quality of the game tends to suffer. So it's often very hard to make really great games for a platform that not many people have. There are exceptions, but often they're passion projects. Like Half-Life Alyx is supposedly, I haven't played it, but it's supposed to be amazing. Everyone who's played it says it's incredible, but not many people actually got to play it because not many people have access to it. Augmented reality is so exciting to me. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity in VR, but AR I can't even see all the opportunity that's out there, because you're rather than trying to create an environment around the player, you're trying to put a game in the environment that's already there. And so if you can put on visors and see monsters playing around in your room and intelligently interacting with jumping onto your desk, knowing it's there and having a realistic physics engine, then running under and hiding it in it, that could open amazing possibilities to turn your own house into a haunted house. And then the house itself is your level design, and it's tactile, it's real. You can go up and down the stairs. And if you want to, for example, turn your neighborhood or your park into a giant MMO raid, that see all that's unbelievable. There's really no limit to at that point. It's very tricky to build that environment and to make things interact with it, but there are people doing it. I've seen tech demos of just at GDC and similar. It's going to happen eventually, and it has amazing potential. The tricky part will be, how do you make these great games that intelligently create good gameplay within levels the developers don't control fully? And that's going to be a really fun challenge. And so, like all the best exciting things, it'll lead to very different cool games that you could not have elsewhere, but those other games won't be all ported over to AR either. So I'm really excited about that. And I think I am perfectly at time. So that has been my talk. I have been your Dungeon Master, Dan Felder, and this has been a lot of fun. Feel free to contact me through all those methods, and I will hopefully get to see you guys again. Have a great jam. Have a great hackathon.